Halitics. I'm Hal Ginsberg, and I'm so happy to be joined today by Andy Ellis. How are you, Andy?
I'm great, Hal. How are you doing?
I'm really well, and I really appreciate what a great friend of this show you've been, coming on Halitics to discuss your campaign for governor in our state, Maryland, and also some exciting news, which we haven't yet broached here, although it's a little bit dated, I guess a month or so, that you have a running mate, Owen Andrews, running with you. And maybe let's just start there real quick. I always center Israel. I want to talk about the crimes of that country and your views on it and so many other things. But first, let's just start with your running mate, why it's so important that you chose Owen and what he brings to the table.
Yeah, so I've known Owen for a very long time. He and I have been doing this Green Party work together since about 2015 or 2016. And we worked together in Baltimore City Green Party leadership. We were very good friends, and we've worked together on a lot of good green campaigns. And over the last few years, up until the spring or summer, we have been not talking as much as we were regularly talking, because school, life, politics, work, all of that type of stuff was just keeping us in different directions. But we reconnected a little bit this spring and summer. And Owen asked me, who are you thinking about as your running mate? And I gave Owen the same three names that I had given him last summer. The only difference was that all three of those people had said no in the meantime. So Owen called back the next day, and he basically said, "Hey, what if I were to be the running mate, and we'd get the band back together, as it were?" And I thought immediately that was a good idea. I started talking to the people who I turned to for campaign advice. They all thought that was an idea, and here we are. So September 19th, we had a launch party at Owen's house. We had over 100 people in his backyard. Probably 85% of those people voted for Wes Moore in 2022, which I think tells you something about the direction of some of the progressive and activist community. And then on the 22nd of September, we officially filed for office in Annapolis. We got good coverage in the Baltimore Sun and the Baltimore Banner that day. And then I guess the last piece of this is last week on Halloween, we officially launched our effort to be part of Maryland's gubernatorial public financing program. So we are ready to go. We are official. We are running as a team at this point, and we are in the public financing program, which I hope we'll have an opportunity to qualify for, be the first small party to qualify for this version of it, and really get the kind of resources we need to run the election we need next November.
That's really exciting stuff, and I'm looking forward to talking to Owen next week. That will probably be a pre-recorded podcast because of the challenges he faces coming on at noon, but I always love having you on live myself. And by the way, 240-242-5646 if you want to join us. I always take questions, and I'll look for comments in the chat if I get an opportunity. Although it's tough with a guest like Andy to lose the focus, to change focus from the guest to the chat. But I will do the best I can. By the way, as a podcaster, I'm certainly intrigued by the fact that you and Owen, and I said Andy and Owen for Maryland. I'm going to show this, but you guys are now doing your own podcast. This is the first, right? Or it's the first live stream. Explain podcasting, live streaming, and what you've been doing in this space.
Yeah, so since about the end of 2023, we had a podcast. Those were pre-recorded deep dives where we went really deep on one person's work. And a lot of it was academics or advocates or activists. And, we'd spend an hour and a half talking in a lot of depth about their work. We're going to continue doing that. There's an episode up on our YouTube page right now that Owen and I did together last week that explained our campaign plan. But what we're launching tonight, in addition to that deep dive, long form podcast approach, is a live stream. And the live stream is going to focus on news. It's going to focus on politics. It's going to focus on activism. And it's really, I think, filling a space that doesn't exist outside of your show and Carlos's show and a few other people's shows in Maryland, where there is an intense focus on what is happening in Annapolis and what is happening with state government. So we think this is a really important way to be able to reach people and to be able to set the narrative ourselves. So we're excited that we got coverage on Fox 45 and the Baltimore Sun and the Baltimore Banner. We don't want to rely on the story being told by those corporate media outlets and want to have a means of telling the story on our own. Now, sure, it's going to go up on YouTube, but we're producing it. We're deciding what the content is. And tonight's episode is going to be the first version of the live stream. So I'm a little bit nervous, but I think it's actually quite helpful for me to come on your show today and to get ready for it. We're going to talk to Taylor Fraser McCollum, who's working on fighting against the data centers down there in Landover. We're going to talk a little bit about the most recent UMBC poll. We're going to talk about U.S.-Israel policy and how Maryland has entangled itself in that. Maybe look back at the elections a little bit and probably even talk about horse racing and why it's going to be an important issue in the 2026 election. So 7 p.m. tonight, YouTube, Go Green 2026. It will be our first episode. Please tune in. We'd love to have as many folks as we can interacting with it. We see this as part of a kind of responsive politics where if people mention to us that there's issues that they want us to talk about and they fit within our campaign platform, we go ahead and we find space in there to talk about them. So we're trying it out tonight, but we hope to continue it throughout the legislative session and probably through the end of the campaign because we think it's a great way to reach people.
I think it's great. I'm really psyched that you're doing that. I also appreciate your mentioning Carlos. He's actually co-hosts with me this week, Fridays. It's usually Mondays, co-hosts with Carlos and his podcast, The Left-Handed Leftist. I think, Andy, you have been a guest on his program already as well.
I have not, but we have talked about it, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to go on there.
All right. Well, I do apologize for getting that wrong. I think I discussed this with Carlos. He said he was going to invite you, and I got confused as to whether you'd actually been on. By the way, one other point on that. Yeah, if you want more information, gogreen2026.com. I didn't put up all the URLs because it gets confusing for people, but obviously you can learn all about it at Andy's website, gogreen2026.com. A lot of issues that you'll be addressing tonight that we'll touch on. I don't want to steal your thunder. I won't do that, but I do have some questions about some of those issues. So we'll get to those. I do want to, as I always do, center really what I think is our nation's great crime, our complicity, really our active participation in the Israeli genocide in Gaza and really on the West Bank too. I don't think we should lose sight that their crime against Palestine extends into the West Bank, where land is being stolen routinely. People are killed as well, not in the same numbers as we saw in Gaza, but still being killed, and all sorts of really horrific atrocities, pogroms being committed by Israel. You see here the ceasefire hasn't ended. This is today's Al Jazeera. And I mean, there's only so much you can say. If you have a quick comment about this, do so, Andy. And I'll just give you a couple of ways to maybe go. One, am I focusing, or do we focus as a nation, as much as I think it's ignored or given short shrift? Are we spending more time on Israel than we should, given that there are other terrible crimes or other atrocities around the world, like the genocide that is sort of heating up again in Sudan? Should that get more attention? And the other way I'd like you to address this is compare and contrast your response to that of Governor Moore, whom you're challenging for the executive mansion.
Yeah. So the first question is the first question. No, we do not spend too much time talking about Israel. We need to talk about the way that United States complicity, the way the United States complicity in Israeli genocide, apartheid, and war crimes is allowing it to continue and allowing it to accelerate. We've needed to talk about it for 20, 30, 40 years. And the fact that we haven't talked about it as a nation for so long has left us in a place where you look at the last election, and it was very clear that this was an issue that was going to be important in the election. And the Democrats knew it, but they didn't have the ability to do anything about it because they, like the Republicans, have suppressed conversation about this to the degree that they had no idea how to handle it when a significant enough block of the voters were willing to draw a red line on this. And they failed miserably, not only to handle it, but to talk about it and to deal with it in the election. So we need to focus as much as we can on this until the genocide ends, and until the apartheid ends, and until the war crimes end, and until, there is a just, democratic, and peaceful resolution to the problem. Two, absolutely, we need to talk about Sudan more. We should not trade the conversation that we have about Sudan off with the conversation we have about Israel, but perhaps we could we could spend more time talking about Sudan and less time talking about the ballroom that is being built in the White House, or whatever other intrigue of the day that we have. So that's the first half of the question. The second half of the question is, how are we different than Governor Moore? And I think it's important here to expand that and say, and whatever generic Republican the Republicans nominate this year, because Israel policy, along with education and criminal justice, are a place where the two parties are in lockstep, and where there is bipartisan agreement on most of the things. So what Governor Moore and the Republicans agree with is that Maryland is a friend of Israel. Israel has a right to defend itself. And Israel has a right to exist. Now, those are really well-crafted talking points put together by people who have a political interest in ensuring that Maryland continues to be committed to Israel. So we don't have that position. We do not believe that Maryland is a friend of Israel and should be entangled with the government of Israel. So we're going to look at everything we can to do to stop and divest from to stop spending Maryland taxpayer funds to invest and support the genocide. There's a lot of different ways that we can manifest that, and we'll talk about some of that on the show tonight. We are polishing up our official Palestine policy, and most of it is simply operating under the idea that Maryland has no business choosing sides in this conflict. It is a state and a country, and it should not be aligning itself politically, economically, or academically with the Israeli government, and we need to end that as soon as we can.
Yeah, I put up this, caption here from this letter that was in the Baltimore Sun at the beginning of this year. So you see it's January 2025. And my understanding, and you just confirmed it, is that despite the pressure that was beginning to be brought to bear on Democrats and the governor to, cut funding for the Maryland Israeli Development Center, which didn't happen, that the governor's pro-Israel policy position was unchanged from January to today. And you're saying that's exactly correct.
That's exactly correct. And it's not just the governor's policy. There's a new program out. There's a new initiative being put on by JVP, which is called Break the Bonds, which is trying to get Maryland to divest itself from the bonds that they have invested in, the Israeli bonds that they have invested in. That is a similar program to what is going on in other countries. So it's not just the governor, it's the comptroller, it's the treasurer, it's the legislature. It is everybody who is in an elected decision-making place in the state of Maryland is aligned with the state of Israel from the beginning of the genocide to today.
So just to put a bow on this, if you find Israel's actions abhorrent, if you view support for Israel as tantamount to support for genocide, and you don't want our state of Maryland to be complicit, to be an accessory before the fact and during the genocide, then vote for Andy Ellis for governor. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. If genocide is a red line for you and not something that you're willing to negotiate or compromise, we will be on the ballot, and we will be an anti-genocide option that you can vote in. And I guarantee you that Wes Moore and whatever generic Republican the Republicans nominate is going to be pro-Israel. This is an issue where both parties are in unilaterals or in unison and bipartisan support. And so if you want a different option, go ahead and vote for us. And if you just want to hear us on the stage of the debates making that argument, go to gogreen2026.com/debate and sign the petition we have that will allow us to be on the Maryland Public Television debate stage so that we can make this argument instead of having the other two parties ignore it and pretend that everything is okay.
Andy, it's sort of a moot point. Well, in Maryland, it is a moot point. But one of the arguments I've heard for trying to I guess, rehabilitate the Democratic Party, reform it, reconstruct it is, hey, Zoran won. Zoran campaigned against Israel. Zoran said its right to exist is dependent on being a true democracy, which it isn't. So doesn't that show that we don't need a Green Party? We just need to find more Zoran Mamdanis or run in the Democratic primary against Wes Moore if you don't like him, rather than run as in a totally different party. And you can see, according to Useful Idiots, which is a really good podcast, Aaron Monde and Katie Halper, the ADL at least appears to be melting down over Mamdani's win. So he must be good.
I mean, yes, we need to have more Mamdanis that are running in the Democratic primary. It would be great if there was an anti-Zionist running against Wes Moore in the Democratic primary, but I don't think there's going to be. So I think I don't think this has to be an or. I think this can be an and. I think we need to have pro-Palestinian people running at every level of office and in every party in order to challenge the status quo. And if you find a Democrat that you like in the primary that is running against or running for governor or running for state delegate or state senator who is willing to challenge Maryland's complicity in genocide, then vote for that person. But if you don't find that person in the general election and you do see us on the ballot in the gubernatorial race, then vote for us. I think there is an industry in making this question more complicated than it needs to be. And so while we can talk about Mamdani all day long, I don't think the Democrats are going to nominate Mamdani to be the governor candidate in the general election in 2026. And I don't think that I'm worried that they're going to nominate anybody other than Wes Moore. So if it is a race between us, Wes Moore, and a generic Republican, and Wes Moore and the generic Republican are both strongly in support of Maryland's commitment to Israel, then I think that it's a pretty easy question for those people who are not strongly committed to supporting Israel to vote for us instead.
All right. In the chat, Ari says hi. He also asks for the link. He wants your live stream link. My saying go to gogreen26.com. 2026.com wasn't good enough. So I will put that up after the program. But Andy, if you can remember to send me an email reminder, please do. And I'll go ahead and put that in the YouTube discussion as well as on Facebook.
And how our YouTube handle is at GoGreen2026. So youtube.com at GoGreen2026. You should see right on the page there the upcoming live stream for tonight.
All right, that makes it pretty easy. You just go to at GoGreen2026. It's just like going to add Halitics. It's pretty. I actually have to give YouTube credit for that. They make it pretty easy to find streams. They really do. So whatever problems we may have with that monopoly, they do make it easy for podcasters, which, by the way, is part of the reason I think they're so successful. Because they do a lot of things behind the scenes. I don't know if you want to comment on this, and especially because it does relate to these giant data centers. But these tech monopolies do enough to make it, they're sticky, right? I mean, Amazon's really convenient. It's really easy to use. Likewise, Google does make it very easy for me to use YouTube, Facebook, likewise. So they do some good things, but that doesn't mean that we should be just stuck with them and nothing else.
Totally. And look, I spent 15 years in the corporate world as a person who focused on technology and tools and tech enablement, and recently worked with AI and all of that. I am not against data. I'm not against technology. I'm not against the internet. None of that. But I do think these mass hyperscale data centers that are being pushed by the fracking industry and by the tech industry and funded by the private equity industry so that trillion-dollar companies can move data around as quickly as possible are a problem. And I think we need to treat them like infrastructure, start regulating them like that, and start thinking about them the same way that we think about the power grid, the water grid, and other things like that, and figure out how to have democratic control of these institutions, and when necessary, to just ban them outright. Like I think it's useful to have places that allow data to be processed. I don't think it's useful to have these hyperscale data centers that are acres of land and take up tons and tons of water that are there to make profits for trillion-dollar corporations. And I think Maryland doesn't need to be in the business of that. Tonight on our show, we'll be talking with Taylor Fraser McCollum, who's one of the people leading the effort against the proposed data center in Landover. And she's going to talk to us about what she's doing in that fight, how she's connecting it to other struggles in the area, and what we can do to help her fight against this. One of the most interesting things that happened last year when Wes Moore passed his round of vetoes in May was that he vetoed a bill in order to investigate or to have a commission to study the impact of data centers in Maryland. And I think the reason he did that is because he's getting a ton of money from people who lobby for data centers. He's getting a ton of money from the private equity companies that own the data centers or that invest in the data centers and the tech companies. And he's getting a lot of money from the tech companies. One of the things I'm excited about that's going to be happening at the beginning of 2026 is we're really going to dive into who it is that is making Wes Moore successful by the kind of donations they're giving. And we're going to put a heavy spotlight on the way that connects to the decisions that he's making and the way the rest of the Democrats are acting in Maryland.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable service. People really should know where the money's coming from. You follow the money and you find out who's really pulling the strings. 240-242-5646 if you want to join us. Please do click subscribe. Please do click like. We've definitely been seeing recent growth in the channel's subscription base and in some of the distribution of our videos. So let's keep that going. Let's keep that momentum going forward. Again, 240-242-5646. So many different directions to go in. Andy, we're going to talk really about your platform in great specific, I hope, towards the end of the program. I know we've been alluding to it and addressing various aspects as we move forward, and we'll do maybe a more specific dive later. I want to get into maybe a little bit more of this discussion about Mamdani and whether the Democratic Party is rehabilitatable. We have seen, and we'll get to Mamdani again, but one of the big arguments, I think, one of the strong arguments for the Green Party, for the Democratic Party, just simply cannot represent the left, right? It just simply is not a vehicle where we on the left, we who believe, as I like to phrase it, and I think many feel the same way, all should have enough, none should have too much, is how I kind of put it together in my little formula. If that's where you believe, I don't think the Democratic Party can truly represent us. It's not enough. Maybe a few people in the party can, but not the party as a whole. And you see here the NAACP saying that deal that was just announced where 8 Dems broke with the allegedly the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and the rest of the party to go along with reopening the government. The NAACP totally trashing that, attacking that. How does that deal prove, if you believe it does, that we do need a party to the left of the Democrats, Andy?
I mean, I think the whole shutdown is really good proof of the fact that we needed that. I don't really, when I look at the deal, I'm not surprised by it at all, because I had never really understood what how the Democrats envisioned the win here, how they envisioned getting out of the shutdown with an extension of the ACA subsidies without really hurting a lot of people. And so I've never really understood the strategy behind the shutdown. I understand the excitement for why people wanted it to continue, because they want somebody who's willing to fight, and they want somebody who's willing to stand for what they believe and not somebody who's willing to capitulate. But I just simply don't understand how they expected this to play out. I don't think Trump was going to blink. I don't think the Republicans care enough about people to be upset if the SNAP funds get terminated or if federal workers don't get paid. And so I guess I kind of look at the deal and sort of say, well, what did you expect to happen? Right? Like, if you understand who the Democrats in the Senate are who switched over, of course they were the ones who switched over. They don't have elections coming up in 2026. And, I think Schumer sort of voted against it with a wink and a nod. I think he orchestrated it so that he could vote against it and give a group of other people the ability to vote against it. I guess when I look at things like this, I really see the Democratic Party doing a balancing act of the factions within the Democratic Party. And the deal is the logical outcome of trying to do that balancing act. So I understand why the NAACP is mad about it. I'd be mad about it too if I had backed the Democrats during the shutdown for these 40 days, and then they capitulated without any new information or really any new offerings.
Well, they got nothing. They basically got nothing. They had a promise for a vote to extend the Obamacare subsidies for 1 year, which, if it happens in December, we're down to a significant extent to the benefit of the Republicans, because they would say, oh, yeah, we passed it. We gave you your subsidies. You should keep voting for us in the midterms.
Right. And so either they're going to, either they're going to vote for it and say, we are always willing to vote for it, and we don't know why the Democrats kept you out of work all this time. We always offered this deal. Either that's going to happen, or they've made the calculation that they can vote against it and be okay. And I don't know. I think, there's a recent UNBC poll that came out that listed healthcare costs and healthcare prices as one of the major economic anxieties that a lot of people have. And I don't think people are going to, there's a lot of sort of Democratic insiders and people who wish they were Democratic insiders, who were internet pundits, who are making the case that this was actually a really smart move by the Democrats. And it may have been a really smart move after 3 or 4 days of the shutdown, but I'm not sure that after 40 days of the shutdown, it doesn't just look like they held out, got nothing, and caused a lot of pain in the meantime.
Yeah, I mean, we disagree a little bit on this. I think they should have continued the shutdown because there was real pressure building in the House, I believe, to do something about those subsidies. A lot of those Republican senators, Republican representatives, I think more than Republican senators, maybe the Republican senators too, were hearing from constituents, you can't take away those subsidies from us. So totally. I think there might have been something that could have been done that would have been a little bit more clearly a victory for Democrats on the subsidy.
I mean, I think once they started the shutdown over the subsidies, they had to stick with it, right? And I think capitulating 40 days in with a deal they could have made 4 days in feels to me like a real loss on their side, a real mistake on their side. And so I think it's like, if you're going to start this shutdown over the subsidies, you got to be willing to stick with it to the end. You can't 40 days in, after causing a lot of pain to people, back out of it at that point and take a deal that had no new offers and no new information.
I want to just bring a couple of comments that I heard. I have slides, but I'm going to leave them off. A couple of comments I've heard from people about the Green Party. Two from two different organizational leaders. So these are progressive groups that are organizing to elect, I guess, leftists, or at least people to the pretty far left end of the Democratic Party. Including groups that have been pretty critical of, Congress members as far to the left as, say, a Jamie Raskin. Yeah. And I've made the point, Raskin's support for Israel, I mean, understanding on the edges he'll criticize Israel, but he clearly supports Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, which is wrong. This is a good reason we should be looking at Green Party candidates. We should be looking at challenges to people like Raskin from the left. And the response, this is from people who really don't agree with him, who agree with us, people who think Kristen Mink, I don't know how familiar you are with her, but she ran as a pretty hard left option in the Montgomery County Council, and she voted to fund the Maryland Israel Development Center. And despite pointing these very clear breaches of their promises to voters, the response is, well, I don't think the Greens have a chance to win. The two parties have a stranglehold. And my response is, well, but you're an organizational leader. The stranglehold can be broken if organizations like Our Revolution and others, I guess PDA calls itself Progressive Democrats of America, say, well, you're not progressive, so we can't support you. if they would join together and start looking at Green Party candidates and other options like Shama Sawant in Seattle, and yet they still won't, no matter how bad the Democrats are. Do you see any way to break that nut, or is it not even worth trying?
I mean, first of all, let me just say Kristen Mink is a sellout who is looking to move up further in politics. If you ask my opinion of it, I think that decision on the Maryland Israel Development Center is a clear example of that. And, I think there's a lot of these Democrats that get elected on using the words of social justice and progressivism. And then when they actually have the power, they become actually quite conservative and quite regressive. I think Kristen Mink is a great example of that. And I think there's other places we can point to where she's done that. This is not the only decision. I also think that a lot of Democrats want to have a monopoly on being the only party that can be a resistance party or the only party of the left. And what that has gotten us is Trumpist fascism. So over the last 20 years, 25 years since Ralph Nader, Democrats have doubled down on the argument that they are the only alternative. They are the only alternative to the fascism of the right wing. And it's one of the things they've been most effective at enforcing. They have shut down the ability of other parties to develop. They have ostracized anybody in their ranks who would dare question the authority of their party. And they have used the mechanisms of government in order to preserve the two-party system because they believe they can win the game of chasing after the billionaires and the corporations. Well, they have lost that game terribly, and we are all, as a world and as a nation and as a state, paying the price for it. But they continue to stick to it because they learned the wrong lesson of the Ralph Nader election. The right lesson of the Ralph Nader election was that if we had moved toward a multi-party system, there would have been more allies for Democrats on a lot of their fights with Republicans about big key things. But because instead of doing that, they embraced the billionaires and the corporations and tried to keep the two-party system intact, they have destroyed the ability of the left to organize progressive alternatives for the last 25 years, and they have entrenched themselves as a party of the status quo, a party of the billionaires, and a party that perpetually loses when it matters and fascism is at the door. So, or
even when it wins, it doesn't pursue policies that will improve the life of the American public. So who really even cares very much who wins? But I still get back to where I was before. I understand your criticisms, which I share 100% of the Democrats. But what about these progressive institutions? I showed a slide from the NAACP calling the deal a betrayal. The NAACP has consistently supported the Democratic Party. It's always been a shepherd, a sheepdog for the Democrats on the not even really that far to the left. And I mentioned the leader who said, well, the two parties have a stranglehold, so there's no point in us even trying to build an alternative. Also, I heard from somebody, and I hear this too, who's also a leader. Well, you like the Greens. Well, why not WFP, Working Families Party, or DSA, which are clearly not the Green Party because DSA isn't even a real party and the WFP runs Democrats. So, there seems to be just a complete failure to understand, as I get it, as I see it, in these institutions that no, the stranglehold is because you won't challenge it. And no, there aren't alternatives.
Right. And there are alternatives, but we have to grow the Green Party into a viable alternative that can help use its ballot line in order to influence outcomes so that the communities that we're fighting for have better material conditions. Once we can start doing that, whether we are winning or losing, we can begin to change the nature of the conversation in a way that allows people to see the value of it. So while the Democrats and the so-called progressives are not speaking in good faith when they make these arguments, they're not entirely wrong. As a party, we need to understand how to move beyond a framework that is about providing people more choices and toward a framework that is about changing the outcomes that people experience in their lived material lives. And so I think that as much as I want to talk about how wrong they are and how much of a part of the problem they are, I think the solution is to have a Green Party that has a clear understanding of what it is supposed to do, what it can do, and how it can help people. And I think if we begin to communicate that clearly and we don't focus everything on winning the horse race in every single election, but we focus on building the power in order to give organized labor, community groups, social movements, outside forces, the ability to have leverage to get the outcomes they need from the status quo, then I think we're going to find a lot more excitement about the Green Party. And that is the push we've taken. The Baltimore Banner wrote a piece about us called "The Green Party is not in it to win it." And while I didn't love the headline, I thought it did a really good job of mainstream media talking about the way that we can use this gubernatorial campaign with our goals of winning the Green Party primary, qualifying for public financing, getting on the debate stage, and securing 100,000 votes to have the best performance since the Civil War as a means of building power and building leverage so that we can change the outcomes that are occurring right now and make sure that Marylanders who can't pay their rent, or children in Maryland who are getting sentenced to adult prison, or people who feel like their vote doesn't matter, to make sure that those things are changing in reality over the next decade. This is going to be a transformative decade. The question is how that transformation is going to work, whether it is going to be more entrenchment of the wealthy, the elite, and the billionaires, or whether it is going to see the emergence of a people's power that comes from the grassroots and challenges the status quo. And I think we have the opportunity to do that. And I would say to the folks in those organizations, like, we don't need you people who are leaders of organizations. We need the rank and file who are frustrated with you all and your foot dragging and your fights for access instead of your fights for material change. Your members are frustrated with you, and we are coming to talk to them, and we don't care what you think. That's what we say to the leaders of those organizations.
Yeah, I love that message, and I think this is the time to just put up some of the policy goals that you have placed on your website, part of your platform, gogreen2026.com. And full disclosure, I think I've got all of them on this slide except for the reparations. You and I have discussed that on more than one occasion. I didn't think it was necessary to revisit that, but that's another podcast that we've had.
Right. We did a whole show about reparations.
We did a whole show on reparations, so we don't need to go there. But I want to just focus for a moment on what you actually have at the top, but I moved it around in this slide where you have create, and this is the third from the bottom. I think people can read this. I'm looking actually at the YouTube stream. It is very clear, so there shouldn't be any difficulty reading it. Create a robust and deep multi-party democracy in Maryland. So, and obviously you can learn more. It says learn more there. But see, I love that because you're saying, hey, this goal in and of itself, our running is part of what we're trying to do here, is give people more choices.
Yep. And not just giving people more choices, give people more choices so that they can get different outcomes. That is the essential piece of what I think we're looking at here, is like, we want to give people choices not to make them feel better about the practice of voting, but in order to make sure that those choices get them different outcomes, get lower rent, get cheaper healthcare, get more affordable housing, get more affordable education, and make sure that folks don't feel like they're powerless. Look, the way that the state government is structured in Annapolis right now is that there is a there's a veto-proof majority that Democrats have in both chambers of the House, both chambers of the Maryland legislature. When there are veto-proof majorities, that leads toward when Democrats have veto-proof majorities, that leads to more conservative policy, more slow rollouts of things, and less big and fast goals, because their job is to try to protect the veto-proof majority. And when their job is to try to protect the veto-proof majority, they err toward protecting the electeds who are in the 4 or 5 purple districts that are in Maryland. That veto-proof majority is the biggest block against progress, democracy, justice, peace, and ecology in Maryland, and we've got to break it. So how do we break it? There's a couple of ways that we do that, and one of them is to push actively for ranked choice voting and proportional representation. This is not a thing that can happen from the outside. Greens and other folks can say all they want how important this is, but Democrats in Annapolis are ultimately going to have to vote for a constitutional amendment that allows for ranked choice voting to come about if we want ranked choice voting. So part of the reason for that is because Democrats have never allowed there to be a citizen initiative in the state of Maryland. So they have a unique hold on the ability. They have a unique hold on the ability to amend the Constitution. So, in addition to pushing,
and let me just jump in real quick on that, Andy. Yeah. I find that so frustrating. When I lived in California, there were all these ballot initiatives, and some of them were long-winded, and the system is corrupted. There's no question. Big money, fast food industry, whatever. There's some examples of that. Can corrupt the system, and they do. But there's still a patina. There's still some real democracy going on, too, with those ballot initiatives in California.
Right. And, in 14 Maryland counties, there are charters at the county level that people can use in order to change things. But that does not exist at the statewide level. And as long as that doesn't exist at the statewide level, every constitutional amendment has to go through the General Assembly and go to the voters. So one of the first things that we would do if we were elected is tell the General Assembly that if they don't pass a constitutional amendment allowing for citizen initiative, we're going to veto everything that they put in front of us, and I think that's the way that we have to think about using the power that we have if we don't have veto-proof majorities backing us. So that would be the first thing that we would do. The second thing we would do is really expand the amount of public policy debate and discussion that occurs on Maryland public television. I think that's a valuable change that could get people more engaged in things and that could probably happen at the executive level. Another thing that we would do is modernize the ballot petition process so that it is easier for charter amendments, third parties, small parties, et cetera, to get on the stage. Another thing we would do is extend public financing across the state to every race governed by the State Board of Elections, because we think that kind of public financing is a key way to level out the influence of money in politics. There's a bunch of stuff on the page there. I think a couple of other ones that I would highlight are making Annapolis more accessible and thinking about moving beyond the 90-day legislative process. I also think that we would like to talk about reforms in Annapolis so that leadership doesn't have so much consolidated power. And an interesting one that we've been thinking about recently is fixing the way that the Constitutional Convention is set up in Maryland. In the 1867 Constitution that rolled back Reconstruction, there is a clause that says that that every 20 years a Constitutional Convention has to go in front of the voters. But it is written so that the threshold of votes for it to pass is something like all of the voters who are in the election, not all of the voters who are on the question. So in 2010, 54% of the people who voted on the question of a constitutional convention voted for it, but about 800,000 people didn't vote on that question, which meant that it didn't have enough votes to pass. So this is an easy fix. Maryland voters are voting for a constitutional convention every 20 years. The next one will be in 2030. And we think there needs to be an opportunity to have that vote count the way that it should count. And look, I don't have any illusion that a constitutional convention is suddenly going to erode a 2-to-1 Democrat over Republican advantage. But it is an opportunity for us to talk about how democracy functions and doesn't function in Maryland. And we need to give voters that opportunity to have those conversations and to use the processes that exist in the Constitution.
That's really interesting about the Constitutional Convention, something I had no knowledge of. I'm not aware of any constitutional conventions in Maryland in recent years, and it seems like there could easily be one if we just had the majority rule determine whether the majority vote of voters determine whether there is a convention. But maybe we all just need to vote for it next go round. But if only half the people vote, even if everybody but one votes for it, it still won't happen. Based on the way you describe it. Andy, you mentioned make Annapolis more accessible. Just looking at that bigger list there, the sort of the broad list of policy goals, that's the bottom one. And it's really hard to get to Annapolis, actually, when you're trying to have, even though we're a really small state, I mean, it's easier to get to Annapolis from D.C. than it is to get to Sacramento from Eureka. But, in terms of getting around the state, it's not easy at all. There's no train. I guess there's a bus, but I don't know. I remember I had to take my son up to BWI one time when he was going to the Eastern Shore. It's so hard to get around the state. It seems like such a low hanging fruit to just have a train line that goes from Baltimore to Annapolis and from DC to Annapolis?
Most of the time when there's not a train line that makes sense, it's because somebody doesn't want that train line there. So why isn't there a train that goes from Baltimore to Columbia so that people can take advantage of all the business opportunities that are in Columbia? Because the people of Howard County don't want a train to bring people from Baltimore into Columbia. Why is there no train to go to Annapolis so that people can testify on bills that are important to them? Because Democrats don't want people testifying on bills that are important to them.
Yeah, I fully believe that. It's tough. Also, people who really care but aren't, are invested but aren't getting paid by a special interest to testify. Right. They have to take a day off work. They have to spend money to get there. They have to pay for parking. The lobbyists, everything's paid for, and they're on salary as well while they're.
Yeah. The 90-day legislative session, the lack of competitive legislative districts, the isolation of the General Assembly, the low salary of legislators, all of these things fit into a matrix of things that make the General Assembly not accountable to voters. There's a really good book by a guy named Stephen Rogers about the accountability of state legislatures, and he identifies all these factors, and Maryland is bad on all of those factors.
I want to just cherry pick a little bit areas when I look at your list that kind of struck me, because we don't have time to go through each one. But the one that I'm interested in: invest in community institutions that can address the root causes of crime and violence. Baltimore is a violent city. It has high crime rates. It has for many, many years. What do you say to a homeowner in Baltimore or a renter who says, "Look, these root causes. I just want more police on the streets." If you're going to start taking money from the police and giving them to some social worker who's going around with a notebook and a pen, that's not going to keep me safe. How do you respond to that?
So I am a homeowner in Baltimore in a neighborhood that has relatively high crime, first of all. So let me start there, right? The second thing is we are not talking about funding social workers. That's really what the Democrat approach to this question is to utilize the nonprofit industrial complex, the social work complex, the universities, in order to do these sort of alternatives to criminal justice. But in a lot of those cases, they are still pathologizing the people in those neighborhoods as the root cause of the problem, and they're just attempting to solve it in a different way. What we believe is that there are institutions in places like Baltimore that have been doing the work on the ground in order to stop the violence for a very long time, and they need the resources in order to scale that work. Baltimore's homicide rate has decreased quite significantly over the last couple of years. And the reason for that is not because this alternative policing formation is working. The alternative policing formation basically says to people, we know you're bad and we're going to arrest you if you don't stop this crime right now. That's okay. It works a little bit, but it is still a criminal justice heavy system, a system that invests in grassroots violence reduction by giving resources to the people and communities who know how to stop violence because they've been stopping violence for decades, is really the right answer to us, or is really the right answer to this. And we can see a lot of successes in some of these things in the decrease in homicides in Baltimore. Those decreases are not because the police have adopted new strategies. It is not because there are social workers out talking to people. It is because there are people who understand what is causing the conflict and what needs to be done in order to stop it. Look,
can you give an example? I don't know if you maybe we're about to, but I really would like to hear you describe this in detail.
Yep. So there's a group called We Are Us, which is a Baltimore unity movement that is working with people who are in communities and might be adjacent to violence, with people who have been on the inside, who are going out and understanding that the root cause of most murder in Baltimore is not drugs. It is not criminal enterprises. It is people who have interpersonal conflicts with one another that escalate, and there's no means of addressing them. We Are Us goes out, and they have folks who have been in those situations, grown up in those communities, been on the inside, and come out who can identify when the conflicts are starting to begin. They can talk to the people who are engaged in them, and they can stop the conflicts from happening, and they can stop the violence from happening. The track record has proven We Are Us is a very good example of what this looks like. The Baltimore ceasefire movement is another good example of what it looks like. These grassroots groups in community that come up with the people who live in the communities that are adjacent to the interpersonal violence are the ones that are going to be able to solve the interpersonal violence. Not in the current situation that we have these neighborhoods, which are the most dangerous neighborhoods, are also the most policed neighborhoods. And so you get this situation where there's a ton of millions and millions and millions of dollars in investment in policing to have armed forces in the neighborhoods that are not bringing peace, they're not decreasing crime, they're not bringing safety and security to the neighborhood. So you have this paradox where the most policed neighborhoods are also the most unsafe neighborhoods. And yes, if your choice is a person with a clipboard or a cop with a gun, a lot of people are going to choose the cop with the gun. But if another choice is that there is well-funded programs like We Are Us that are connecting guys that have been on the inside, the guys who've gotten out of the life, who are willing to go out there and have conversations with the people who are engaging in the violence and stop the violence as it is bubbling up, most people in community are going to say those things should get some investment as well.
All right, let me throw something at you that I was really thinking while you were speaking. Now, I'm a huge fan of old movies. If they're black and white, I'm much more likely to watch them. And I really like some of the old 1930s Warner Brothers kind of ripped from the headlines movies. They have a lot of those movies address inner city conflict. James Cagney, I don't know if these names are familiar to you. There's Dead End, which is about a gang in a housing project. And one of the ways that they show the response by the communities to some of this criminal behavior is where police do what you're describing. So you have cops on the beat who are walking through the neighborhoods. They're like, yeah, I know this guy, I know this gang leader, I grew up with him. They try to bring them together in nonviolent. They'll be like, I mean, it's very contrived. I'm not denying any of that. They'll put the two rival gang leaders in a boxing ring, so they can punch it out rather than have a rumble, that kind of thing. Is that a little bit like what you're discussing? Does it make sense to have police who are trained in this? So maybe they still have that gun, but their also first thought is, let's try to tamp down the violence and come up with alternative solutions. Or is that just not at all what you're talking about?
I mean, that may have worked in the 1930s, though I doubt it worked in most black communities in the 1930s any more than it works in most black communities in Baltimore right now. Look, obviously, we need police who are more connected to the community, less willing to bust heads, less willing to try to arrest people just for stats. But that's not what's happening right now. The police are out there hunting down these gun crimes, hunting down these drug crimes, and throwing the book. The war on drugs may have ended, but it has now become a war on guns and neighborhoods that were devastated by the war on drugs, so that people can't own guns on their own, right? If you're in one of those West Baltimore neighborhoods where a bunch of people got felonies during the O'Malley administration because he was illegally rounding up people in order to build his political name so that he could become governor, you can't legally own a gun. And if you're a person that runs a cash-based business in one of those neighborhoods, a small cash-based business, you're at threat, you're at risk. The police aren't protecting you, and you may have a gun in that situation because you need it to protect your family and your business and your cash-based enterprise that feeds your children. And if you're not allowed to have it and you get caught with it and you get sent away to 30 years, right, that is destabilizing those type of communities pretty aggressively. So it may have worked in the 1930s with Irish mobsters or Italian mobsters or something like that, but I don't think it's ever worked for black communities. What we need is an investment in the kind of things that, like We Are Us, which are working in those communities in order to stop the violence. Now, if we want to give more money to the police, I'm all for giving more money to internal affairs so that they can do the investigations of the police that are corrupt, that are dealing drugs, that are hurting people, that are working in hand with the gang leaders. I'm all in favor of giving more money to the fingerprint labs and to the gun testing labs in order to find the people who are pulling the trigger and killing other folks and make sure that we get convictions in those cases. And I'm all for making sure that we do have, police. It would be ideal if we had police that were interacting in a positive way in communities, but that is not what is happening in these hyper-police communities, and it has not been happening no matter what we promise the reform is, because the orientation of the police toward those communities are inherently violent, they need to be policed, and that all means necessary are available in order to deal with the people in those communities.
Okay, so let's move to another topic. That's a very complete answer. I really appreciated Andy Ellis running for governor here in Maryland next year. In terms of the climate crisis, perhaps the greatest existential threat we face, I take the genocides as even more requiring our attention, even more urgent, but certainly the climate catastrophe, call it what you will, the unraveling of our environment is extraordinarily important. I saw a post somebody shared with me that we're not moving forward, that the West, and specifically the United States, but other Western countries have kind of given up the fight against the fossil fuel industry because there's not really profit in fighting the climate crisis. How do you persuade poor, struggling, working, middle-class people who say, hey, I got to just survive today. I can't worry about surviving a flood that might happen in 20 years. How do you create a strategy to fight the fossil fuel industry, to fight a climate crisis that also doesn't reduce the quality of life and the purchasing power of people who are barely surviving right now?
It should not be the responsibility of the poor working class person in order to fight the fossil fuel companies and to fight the way that they have captured the energy sector in this state. It should be the responsibility of the government to fight on behalf of those people against those companies. So what we have in Maryland is this system where we deregulated the power supply and then gave monopolies to certain big corporations that are now making record profits off of hiking people's rates. What we need to do instead is we need to find a new system. We're involved in this regional transmission organization called PJM, and it regulates the power supply for a bunch of states. It's a nonprofit, but it ostensibly serves the fossil fuel companies and their interests and the utilities and their interests. What we need to do is create a new multi-state organization that is about green power, that is about democratically controlled power grids, and that puts ratepayers at the center of the question instead of corporate profits. Once we begin to do that, we can begin to get control of the system. We can begin to put it under democratic control. We can begin to figure out reasonable plans to get as much renewable production online as possible. And we can pass policies that make the polluters pay so that we can afford to have that transition. Too much of the way that it is done right now is put on individuals and ratepayers instead of governments and corporations where the problem lies. And we need to have government take control of the situation, regulate the corporations until we put them out of business, and make sure that ratepayers are at the center of our decision making and not a secondary consideration after we think about corporate profits and campaign donations.
All right, Andy, we're getting close to the end of the hour, but I have one more little topic I want to broach with you. And this goes to the issue of the incorruptibility, in quotes, of the Green Party or of alternatives to the major parties. One of the great arguments, I think, but one of the many persuasive arguments to vote for the Green Party is that even when you get a Democrat that says the right things, you think they're going to do the right things. I was excited about Jamie Raskin, to be perfectly honest. He's disappointed me greatly. I was excited about AOC. She's disappointed me greatly. Bernie has disappointed me to some degree. Mamdani may well do the same. The Democratic Party is like a giant barrel of rotten apples, and you can put a bright, shiny apple into that barrel, but I think it's much more likely that that apple is going to get wormy and rotten than that it's going to turn all the other apples into bright, shiny apples.
Right. That's not the way the apple science works, right? Apple science means that when one apple is decaying, the other ones start to decay as well.
Exactly. It's going to transfer its toxicity, its corruption to everything around it. But look at what the Green parties in Europe did before the election last year. the Green parties in Europe actually do have a little bit of influence in Germany. I guess they have a critical mass. They're in the Bundestag. They get people elected. They have some influence. And with that influence, look at this. They tell us, don't challenge Kamala because what a threat to democracy if she loses, ignoring the fact that Harris herself was a threat to democracy, that her party itself had greatly compromised and weakened the democratic institutions and safeguards that we had. And I attribute that in part to the fact that the Green Party has some power. Those Euro Green Party groups have power. So what's to keep Green Party winners in this system from acting like winners everywhere else, which is to keep everyone else from becoming winners?
I mean, there's no party affiliation that is going to stop people from, the siren song of corruption. It's the way that a lot of government works, and the antidote to that is to have strong people-powered movements backing the insurgent candidates that we get into office. So one of the things that I'm hopeful about Mamdani, I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful, is that all the people who were mobilized in order to get him elected will be mobilized in order to hold him accountable and hold the other Democrats around him accountable. If he can do that, that's sort of the exact opposite of the way that Barack Obama did it after his groundswell of support. And if Mamdani can flip that on his head and create an institution that keeps people accountable to their promises and to the people, that will be a great outcome. That is what we as Greens need to be pursuing while we're building the kind of power we can in order to win elections, is a people-based movement that can hold us accountable and can be the resistance to that temptation of corruption. I sometimes worry that a singular unitary Green Party candidate that got elected, like in Baltimore City to the council or in Montgomery County to the council, where there were one Green amongst a bunch of Democrats, would just be so tempted to switch to the Democratic Party in order to get the things done that are important to them, that if we got the win before we had the people power, we would quickly lose the candidate.
Yeah, I mean, that's so there's really no answer. I mean, my answer to that is we somehow have to figure out a way to greatly reduce wealth and income inequality, because the temptation to be corrupt is so much greater when, if you are corrupt, your life improves drastically compared to if you're not corrupt. But if everyone has health care, everyone has a decent, secure life, no one has 3 mansions, 5, exotic cars, and a yacht, nobody has those things, then you're not really getting very much for being corrupt. You're not getting that much, and you are running risk. So that to me is the answer. But you can't change the taxes, you can't change distribution of wealth and income unless you elect people who will then have the incentive to not change the system.
Totally. I think the short-term best answer to that question is these type of public financing systems that a lot of people in Montgomery County are using, that 6 counties in the state use, and that we are participating in for the gubernatorial race. These systems are not a silver bullet that solves the problem of money in politics, but they do change the equation quite substantially. If we are able to get 1,200, or if we're able to get 1,500 Maryland donors who each donate, who have a cap of $250 and donate $120,000 total, we qualify for a 6 or 7 times match on that, which means that next August, the Green Party campaign could have $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 going into the fall election. Those type of systems, those type of programs change the incentives for where people get their money from and how they view fundraising. The difference between a $250 max dollar donation and a $6,000 donation that can be spread across multiple LLCs and multiple family members and that type of thing is significant. And for us, that means that every single organizing interaction we have also becomes a small fundraising interaction, because if somebody can give us $5, that helps us get to the 1,500 people goal. Whereas in the traditional system, if you give somebody $5, they'll pat you on the head and say, "Isn't that cute?" and then get back on the phone and call somebody up and ask them for $6,000 and figure out what deals they have to cut in order to get that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. But that also presumes or requires donors to keep candidates accountable and not to say, okay, well, I liked AOC in 2018, so I still like her now, rather than say, wait a second, they said some good things, but now I'm not going to give them money and they're not going to get those matches, and someone else can defeat them. I mean, that's really, you have to be able to take down politicians who disappoint you. You have to be prepared to do that. And sadly, voters don't appear to be very willing to do that.
We do not have a system right now that is designed to hold elected officials accountable to voters. We have a system right now that is designed to hold elected officials accountable to donors, party bosses, and national narratives. And until we shift that, we're not going to have a system where voters are at the center of the process. And so we need to keep at the front of our mind that while we are building a movement that can not just provide choices but can change outcomes, the key way to do it is to make it so that politicians are accountable to voters, and not national narratives, party bosses, and donors.
All right, Andy, it is past 1. I don't know if you have a few more minutes. I actually have a couple more questions I'd like to throw at you if you're good with that.
Yeah, sure.
So one of the issues that I've actually found intriguing is redistricting, is how Democratic-controlled states are rejiggering their maps so that they can have more blue seats to counteract the efforts of the governors of Texas and Florida and other states to have more Republican Congress members. I was really intrigued by the response by California Green Butch Ware, who is running next year, I believe, for governor there, just as you're running for governor here as a Green. He was very against that. And he said on TV, I actually had the clip, I'm not going to play it now, that you don't fight fire with fire, you fight fire with water, which I thought was a very interesting way to put it. He actually was quoting Fred Hampton for that proposition. You have been critical of Governor Moore's redistricting commission. I've taken the position, hey, in this case, I would fight fire with fire. I don't want to see a Republican House of Representatives determining, doing everything possible to keep the White House in Republican hands if there's any question about that in a few years. And the policies that Trump has pushed through with Republican support have been really, really, really bad. Not that Democrats aren't also bad. I don't think you share that position, but I'm not certain. You did tweet about this. I want to put this up here where you kind of mock. You don't say you're necessarily against it, but you criticize Moore's support for this redistricting commission when he was against redistricting, against the commission to study reparations, as I understand it. So maybe you can clarify where you come down on all of this.
Yeah. So first of all, when Governor Moore vetoed the study on data centers, when he vetoed the study on reparations, and when he vetoed the study on polluter pay climate policies back in May, he did so by saying that we don't need any more commissions or we don't need any more studies. We know the answers to these things and we just need to act. Right. So I thought that was a politically convenient position for him to take at the time. And I think this appointment of a commission or appointment of a strategic plan, like he keeps doing with other executive orders, is a pretty good sign that that was, in fact, political pandering to a group of people who would be excited to hear that argument at the time. He's perfectly happy with commissions if they help his political future. He's against commissions if they hurt his political future, and that's fine. He should just be honest about that and not pretend that he's taking a virtuous stance or something like that. So that's the first position on this. The second position is, in a two-party system with single-member districts, it seems pretty much inevitable to me that this is the response. This is what happens when that system gets into its doom loopiest type of situation, where you got to go tit for tat. And it makes sense that Maryland, in the world that we live in the world that they see in this two-party system, it makes sense that Maryland would try to do that redistricting, because that's the game that they've set up to play with the Republicans in the two-party doom loop. So I don't I don't, and I think it would be different. I would vote against it probably if it was on the ballot like it was in California. But because this is not going to voters, I certainly understand why they're doing what they're doing. At the end of the day, the real answer and the real problem to this, though, is the congressional law that requires single member districts to be the way that we appropriate House seats. As long as single member districts are appropriated for House seats, there's not going to be any lines that are fair or that aren't political. Those lines are drawn by people, whether a robot informs them or an academic informs them or pure political power informs them, and they're going to be used by the people in power to exert influence over the people not in power. That's just the nature of single member districts. What we need to do, and the best way to solve this problem, is to have our congressional delegation push for Congress to repeal the laws that require single member districts for House seats and to move toward a proportional representation system, which would allow there to be no gerrymandering because the state is a district, and the proportion of votes that people got in that would determine the House seats. This works well in New Zealand. It works well in other places, and it is probably the single biggest change that we could make that would fix American democracy the most in Congress without a constitutional amendment. So fine, go ahead, take away Andy Harris's seat. That's fine, whatever, right? Like, you're going to do it because you have to do it. But like, the real solution to this is not some independent redistricting commission or some technocratic solution where a robot draws the lines for us. The real solution to this is moving toward a proportional system that would allow more voices to be heard, more representation to be balanced, and the votes to be based on how people's political instincts actually, or political choices actually are, and not how map makers in Annapolis want them to be.
All right, so let's just drill down to that for just a moment. So are you saying that you would support proportional representation where in a particular district or state or what have you, the makeup of at least one of the houses in the legislature is determined by votes by party? So in other words, if 30% vote for Green and 40% vote for Democrat and 10%, I don't know, whatever, vote for Republican and there's Libertarians, you would have a makeup of the state of one of the houses, at least in that way? Is that what you're saying? Because I want to give you an alternative, but I just want to understand if that's where you stand.
There's a whole lot of ways to do proportional representation, and the question of how we do it is a really good question that would need to bring academics, policymakers, and historians together. It would require studying how it's happened in the United States in the past, and it would require studying how it happens in other parts of the world. I'm not a political scientist, and I'm not going to offer that there is one silver bullet way of doing proportional representation that would be the ideal. We got to have these conversations. We got to debate it out. We got to look at the alternatives. But the idea that we have single member districts is the linchpin for how we have gerrymandering. It is the linchpin for how we have an entirely polarized Congress. It is the linchpin for how we have these primaries that push toward the edges of the Republican Party, and I think do the same thing in the Democratic Party, but not the way that most people think. I think the primary system we have pushes Democrats further to the right in a lot of cases and pushes Republicans further to the right. So the thing that underlies all of that is congressional law that requires there to be single member districts for House seats. The biggest bang for the buck that we can have for democracy is repealing that and allowing states to be innovative in the way that they allocate, in the way that they go about proportionality, so that the seats can better reflect the electorate and not be drawn in order to win wars in DC like they are right now. Well,
I wholeheartedly support what you're saying, Andy. I don't know if that's the single biggest thing, but maybe it is. It's incredibly problematic the way we do it.
I think it is the single biggest thing. There's a really good book about this called Parliamentary America that makes the case for why this is the most important democracy reform that we could make, that would get at all the other democracy reforms that we need to make. It would get at campaign financing. It would get at the two-party system. It would get at media control, and it would get at resources. and it does not require a constitutional amendment. I think that's the key part to it. So if I were to have something that I could say to Governor Moore and his commission that includes also Brooks and some other federal folks, it would be like, fine, do whatever you're going to do here to have your tit for tat with the Republicans, but then go to Washington and make sure that you build the kind of coalition that can allow us to get out of the two-party doom loop that we have right now that is going to destroy our country and enable the further fascist takeover of the U.S.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's very persuasive. I'll just put in a quick plug for what I think seems to make a lot of sense are multi-member districts where we don't have district by state, but you have districts and maybe 3 or 4 or 5 representatives from each district, and they're chosen by single transferable vote rather than you don't get 5 votes.
Right.
You get 1 vote, but then you get to rank, and then your vote goes to the next candidate once your choice is either elected or
When we talk about electoral reforms, there's really 2 mechanisms to think about. One is how we count the votes. That's ranked choice voting. And the other is how we allocate the seats. That's proportional representation, right? And I think that distinction is really useful. Ranked choice voting is not an electoral reform. Ranked choice voting is a voting reform. Proportional representation is an electoral reform because it gets at the question of how we allocate power, not how we count the votes.
Right, but if you have a multi-member district and you rank 1 through 5, then you actually have some impact over each of those 5.
Totally.
And you don't have, but it's not as though it's just the person who gets the most votes who wins and everyone else doesn't. Right. Or even what we have in Montgomery County, where you have several at large, but you get as many votes as there are at large candidates. Then
that is like I think that is called like multi-member plurality or something, and it is the worst form of voting when it comes to accountability and representation.
You mean what we have in Montgomery County now, where you get as many votes as there are? Yeah.
Yep. But what we have in Montgomery County and what we have for the state delegates right now is the worst way of voting in order to ensure accountability and to ensure representation.
Yeah, I think what it's called here is multi-member, what I'm calling for multi-member proportional districts.
Yep.
And,
I agree with you on that. Yeah, we need multi-member proportional districts. But like what I'm saying is that there's 2 aspects to that. There's a lot of push for ranked choice voting, and I support that push for ranked choice voting. I think it's a good innovation, but it is not going to change the way that power is allocated. It is going to change the way that votes are counted. And that may get us slightly different results sometimes, but it is not suddenly going to be a boon to new parties that allow them to emerge. That's just not how it's going to work. But a proportional system like what you're talking about, where there is ranked choice voting as the way of counting the votes, is going to reallocate power. And when we talk about redistribution, we need to not just talk about redistribution of wealth, but we need to talk about redistribution of power. And that system that you're describing, the system that I'm describing, redistribute power by making it so that there is a structural incentive for multiple parties to exist in the General Assembly or the Congress.
All right, Andy, one last issue I sort of wanted to get at, and since you're being so generous with your time, I'm taking advantage of you, and this kind of goes to the question we already touched on a little bit, was the climate crisis issue. Do you see, and I mentioned how the West has kind of given up on, many countries, certainly the United States, has given up on the idea of regulating the fossil fuel industry. You saw a comment, or regulating and supporting it, right? Giving them land to drill in on and stuff, not taxing them, tax breaks that they don't deserve. Whereas China, for example, is actually making real progress in reducing its output of CO2. Does that mean we need a command and control economy? Is that ultimately the answer, that some sort of a one-party system where the leadership really doesn't care what the business, maybe they care what businesses want. Sure they do. They're corrupt. They have capitalism and communism together in China. But ultimately, where you maintain power, even if you buck some powerful interests. Is that the answer?
I mean, it is an answer to a question. I don't know if it is the answer to the question of what do we do in Maryland about the climate crisis and energy crisis that is facing us, because I'm not sure that we have the ability to create that effective of a command and control structure. So I don't know. I would say a year ago, when I was thinking more broadly about the world, instead of just very focused on what we need to do for the people of Maryland in order to have better energy costs and better able to survive the climate crisis that are coming, I would have had a more thoughtful answer to this question. I appreciate the theoretical question, but for Maryland, what we need to do is to create a system where we are not giving corporations the ability to determine how much energy we have, what type of energy we have, and how much people pay for it while we're subsidizing them. And instead, while we have those corporations, we need to have them serve the ratepayers instead of their shareholders. And we need to move as quickly as we can to remove those corporations from the question so that they are not determining our energy policy based on their profit margins, but instead we are running an energy policy that is based in the lives and the pocketbooks of Marylanders.
I really, really, really appreciate the discussion and your time. I look forward to the live stream tonight. I look forward to speaking to Owen next week. Thanks again.
Thank you, Hal. I appreciate it, and I always love the opportunity to come on.
Oh, let me turn down that. It's a little loud. I don't mean it to be that loud, the closing music. Yeah, I appreciate that. And also good luck. Good luck in your campaign.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. I'll be back tomorrow. Thank you all for being part of Halitics.